皆様、お時間となりましたので、ご退席くださいませ。
Please be seated, ladies and gentlemen. It is now time to get started with part 2 of the symposium. The moderator for part 2 is to be served by Dr. Takagi Seiichiro, Senior Research Advisor of JIIA, and the theme for part 2 is What Promotes and Prevents Reconciliation. Let me introduce the panelists. From the United States, we have Dr. Yinan He, Associate Professor of Lehigh University, and she is specialized in the politics of memory and reconciliation, East Asia and international security, Chinese and Japanese foreign policy, to be followed by Professor Ji Yong Kim, Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Arts and Science at the University of Tokyo. And next to her, Professor of Osaka University, Professor Kazuya Sakamoto, and he is specialized in Japan-U.S. relations. Next to him is a Professor Emeritus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, currently the Senior Researcher of IDJETRO, Professor Chonchai Bunichako. And he is specialized in the modern history in Southeast Asia. So now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Takagi of JIA. Thank you very much indeed. My name is Takagi of JIA, and I would like to serve as the moderator for part 2. We have 4 speakers, and they would give an initial round of presentation. And going through their resume, there is a specific case being focused upon for Japan, and conditions for reconciliation or impediments against reconciliation are being referenced by the papers of other speakers. So after the first round of presentation, I would like to invite the panelists to discuss among themselves, and then finally open the floor for questions and comments from the floor. That is how I intend to proceed. The morning session didn't necessarily have a very strict limitation of time because it was lunch after part 1, and this session has a very tight schedule, and so 10 to 15 minutes at most for each speaker. So if you go beyond 15 minutes, I would ring the bell. So please abide by time. So introducing Professor Yinan He, Associate Professor of Lehigh University.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank the Japan Institute of International Affairs for inviting me to speak at this symposium. My presentation is based on my book, The Search for Reconciliation. The cover of the book is showed up on the slide. When researching and writing the initial manuscript, I was supported by the Mamosho Scholarship and spent quite a bit of time at the University of Tokyo. Although the book came out a few years ago, this is my first chance to present it with colleagues in Japan. I'm very delighted to have this opportunity. The central question that I try to answer in this book is, after traumatic conflicts, why have some former enemy countries reached the reconciliation? Why for others, reconciliation seems a bridge too far? My research focuses on the 2 cases of post-war German-Polish and Sino-Japanese relations. These 2 pairs of countries are similar in many ways, from their geographic proximity to traditional cultural and economic ties and recent history of traumatic conflict. They also faced a similar international pressure of the Cold War, one side being a communist country, the other is a capitalist ally. However, several decades after the war, Germany and Poland have by and large put their traumatic history behind, while China and Japan are far from reaching that point. This slide shows Polish public polls taken since 2009. The most recent one was done in last year, 2016, when Poland and Germany celebrated the 25th anniversary of their Treaty of Good Neighborship and Friendly Cooperation. The Polish respondents were asked the question, do you agree that it is possible for Polish-German relations to be friendly and based on partnership? In 2016, close to 79% of them were optimistic about the future of their friendship. And this is consistent with results from previous polls. But for Sino-Japanese relations, as you can imagine, we see a totally different picture. Here's a slide showing joint polls done in Japan and China over the last decade. The blue curve indicates the Japanese negative perception of China, and the light pink curve is for Chinese negative impression of Japan. Clearly, their mutual images are terrible and have been going through a downward spiral in recent years. In explaining such a gross discrepancy in reconciliation outcomes between the two cases, my book highlights the role of historical memory, in addition to material interests and factors. I define reconciliation by the concept of deep interstate reconciliation, which is a truly harmonious relationship in both government-to-government and people-to-people dimensions between former enemy countries. To understand the role of historical memory in shaping international relations, I formulate a so-called national myth-making theory, which argues that the ruling elites who harbor special political ideological goals tend to construct historical myths that glorify or whitewash actions of their own nation in past conflict while blaming others for causing the tragedy. National myth-making is essentially politicization of history. The myths created in the process can cause sharp disagreement between former enemy countries on matters of historical interpretation. Divergent memories in turn generate negative emotions and perceptions of hostile intention between former enemies. Emotion and intention are the two causal mechanisms that lead from national myth-making to reconciliation failure. Conversely, if former enemies can agree on a basic interpretation of their history of conflict through dialogue and joint history writing, and take substantial measures to redress the trauma such as apology, forgiveness, war crimes trials, and war reparation, they will be more likely to reach what I call historical settlement. Doing so can remove the historical roots of bilateral tension and significantly facilitate reconciliation. Now we apply the argument to the two cases. In the interest of time, I will only give a rough sketch of the case findings, especially with regard to the German case that has been discussed a lot this morning at the panel. In the first two decades after the war, West German conservative elites encouraged historical amnesia about Nazi atrocities against other nations, including Poland, and Polish official history highlighted the Polish national victimhood and identified Germany as the chief perpetrator. The result is what I call combative narratives about the war history, which activated the mechanisms of emotions and intention to the extreme. There was no chance for reconciliation. In the 70s and 80s, a trend of historical demythification began, reflected in German education reform, Ostpolitik policy of reconciliation, and limited political liberalization in Poland. Another significant development, as has been mentioned this morning, is the German-Polish textbook cooperation project that started in 1972. These efforts changed their historical memories from the previous combative narratives to conflictual narratives, where their memory gap considerably narrowed. Historical demythification reduced the emotional and psychological obstacles to reconciliation. After the Cold War, the German society essentially committed to forthright acknowledgement of Germany's war responsibility. In Poland, the democratic transition delegitimized the historical myth-making and favored more honest, balanced national historiography. Their historical narratives became increasingly convergent, which greatly diminished the popular grievances about past suffering and promoted mutual trust between the two nations. As for the Sino-Japanese relations case, initially things went quite similar to that in the German-Polish case. In the 1950s and 60s, Japanese conservative elites purveyed national myths that denied war responsibility to Asian countries and glorified the imperial army. However, Beijing did not take issue with Japan about the history issue, but deliberately set it aside because it wanted to play a moderate tone to Japan in the hope of winning Tokyo's diplomatic recognition of the communist regime. Chinese historiography about World War II at the time emphasized, quote, the small handful of Japanese militarists should be strictly separated from the ordinary Japanese people. This led to what I call quasi-convergent narratives, which is really a variant of conflictual narratives. Such narratives ought to be able to permit a moderate progress in reconciliation, but it was not the case in this period because the Cold War power structure trumped everything else. For about 20 years, Japan and China did not have a normal diplomatic relationship. In the 1970s, in order to quickly achieve diplomatic normalization, Beijing accepted Tokyo's ambiguous apologies and renounced claims for war reparation. Also, no cross-national textbook cooperation was held after normalization. Their historical memories remained quite conflictual with one another, even during this honeymoon period of their relationship. From the 1980s onwards, Japanese national myth-making continued, but domestic contestation between conservatives and progressive forces intensified, such as demonstrated in the 1982 textbook controversy. These internal struggles in Japan spilled over to the international stage and provoked strong criticisms from China. In China, in order to enhance internal cohesion and boost regime legitimacy, Beijing employed a twofold strategy of attacking Japan's historical attitude in the diplomatic arena and launching a patriotic education campaign at home, focusing on Chinese victimhood and heroic resistance during the anti-Japanese war. Therefore, a mixture of conflictual narratives in the official rhetoric and combative narratives in the popular discourse developed, which activated the mechanisms of emotion and intention that severely impeded reconciliation. Just a few words about recent developments. From the 1990s, there were at least 3 brief periods of what I call history ceasefire. One is between 1989 to 1993, when Beijing needed Tokyo's support to break out of its post-Tiananmen international isolation. One is from 1999, after Jiang Zemin's controversial visit to Japan until 2001. And the third one is between 2006 to 2009. Those are the years after Koizumi stepped down. But new escalation took place in between these ceasefire periods, and since the turn of the 2010s, history disputes have been, of course, re-erupted and closely intertwined with territorial disputes between Japan and China, seriously straining their relationship. The anti-Japanese demonstrations that broke out in 2012 were the largest scale and the vandalism the worst since 1972. The Chinese public was so fiercely angry that time, largely because of a perceived historical humiliation. Tokyo expressed the intention to nationalize Senkaku Diaoyu Islands on July 7th, which is the anniversary of Sino-Japanese War in 1937. And the island purchase was confirmed on September 10th, which was 2 days after Chinese President Hu Jintao told Prime Minister Noda not to go forward with nationalization. This timing was also shortly before September 18th, the anniversary of the Mukden incident in 1931. Here, history and reality were mixed up. This is not to refute that the fact that territorial interests are real and Japan and the rising China are engaged in a power rivalry. But their security dilemma has been made much worse by their clashing views of history. I wanted to quickly show the results of public opinion polls conducted in the last 2 years. You can see that Japan's failure to redress its war history was named in both years as the top reason for Chinese dislike of Japan. And the feeling seems to be mutual, as the next slide shows that China's constant bashing of Japan about the history issue, its heavy-dosed anti-Japanese propaganda, and excessive nationalistic sentiments and behaviors all made the Japanese people feel sick and repugnant to China. To conclude, findings from post-war German-Polish and Sino-Japanese relations show that a history of conflict does not doom states to future conflict. Instead, how the memory of the conflict is constructed and manipulated for political purposes can significantly affect the likelihood of reconciliation. World leaders who are concerned with interstate reconciliation should take historical memory seriously, especially to emphasize the construction of a shared history and memory. This does not mean that the former enemy countries can or should reach a perfect consensus on every aspect of their war history. But cross-national dialogue free of political constraints will help produce genuine understanding of each other's perspective and bridge their emotional and perceptual gap about the past and future. Thank you.
どうもありがとうございます。しっかり時間を守っていただいて。
Thank you very much for abiding by time. I am very grateful. Now, centering on the case in Korea, I would like to introduce Professor Ji Young Kim.
Thank you very much. I'm Ji Young Kim from the University of Tokyo. Let me start first saying that the history problem, and especially the Comparative dispute, has been a continuous stumbling block between Japan and South Korea. But this issue has many aspects and many sides, and cannot be reduced simplified understanding of bilateral relationship. So therefore, analyzing the problem and finding possible solution should be done from many different perspectives and viewpoints. And my research here today is focused on one aspect, which is a change in Japan's domestic discourse. This does not mean that I'm placing all the blame on Japan's side, on the Japanese side. In fact, examining this issue from different perspectives, including that of South Korea, is a future research project that I plan to pursue in the near future. Okay, let me get started. The title of my talk today is Settlement Without Consensus, International Pressure, Domestic Backlash, and the Comparative issue. It is based on the article that I have recently published in Pacific Affairs with Professor Jae-Young Son at Rikkyo University. And since I only have 10 minutes today, I will briefly summarize the key issues and key questions and arguments and implications that we have laid out in the longer article. So take a look at this picture, and as many of you already know, the Kampa woman statue has become an important symbol in the Kampa woman dispute. And this picture shows the clash between South Korean citizens and South Korean police, as the citizens are trying to install the statue in front of Japanese consulate in Busan, while the police is blocking them. And this is important because it happened after the 2015 history Comparative the settlement between Japan and South Korea. So, first of all, we can ask whether this December 2015 settlement actually brought a final and irreversible resolution over Kampa-woman dispute. In the article, we see the 2015 settlement as incomplete because all the parties involved in the resolution are unhappy with the outcome for different reasons. For example, the Korean civil society opposed the resolution because it argued that the Japanese government still sidestepping of its legal responsibilities and it lacks a direct apology and pledge to ensure historical education. And also, the Korean side argued that the Japanese government still deny the forceful recruitment of Kampa women. But in the Japanese side, Japanese government also, I believe the people are not happy because they don't think that the Korean government is making sincere effort to remove the Kampa woman statue installed in front of Japanese embassy in Seoul as it promised. Okay? And if you move to international community represented by UN, the UN announced after resolution that the resolution did not take a victim-oriented approach and the Japanese government should accept official responsibility for the violation of human rights. So now I focus on the gap between international community and Japanese government. In fact, the civil society in South Korea and Japan have framed the Kampa woman problem as one of international human rights, using it to put pressure on the Japanese government. But we can say that these activities have failed to change the position of Japanese government, still arguing that its legal responsibilities have been finalized through the 1916 Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and South Korea. And furthermore, there has been a gradual shift in public opinion in Japan since the early 1990s. For example, in 1993, 51% of Japanese public thought that the Japanese military forcibly recruited the Kampa woman. But the number dropped to 35% in 2014. Then the key question of my research is how can we explain this gap? So as an analytical frame to approach these questions, I have employed a spiral model proposed by Lis and Sisink. And this model suggests a 5-step process through which a country socializes itself with international norm, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. In the first 2 steps, a country represses human rights groups and denies any violation of human rights. In the next phase, the country shows tactical concession in consideration of its international image. Then national government begin to engage in an argumentative process with their opponents and gradually change their political rhetoric and accept the validity of international norms. In the final stage, international norms are institutionalized in the domestic law, which will not be affected by a change of leadership. Then, where is Japan in this 5-step process? We argue that Japan is stuck around step 3, or tactical concession stage. As an example of tactical concession, the Japanese government has announced Kono Statement in 1993 and established Asian Women's Fund in 1995, and also 2015 resolution could be understood as an act of tactical concession. Then, why is Japan still locked in the tactical concession stage? Our argument is that domestic backlash against international pressure has blocked the country from advancing to the next level of norm diffusion. So, in order to support this argument, we have conducted in-depth case studies on 3 periods during which pressure from international community was particularly intense. All these 3 case studies indicate that intense international pressure cause backlash and reinforce nationalistic perception toward the Khampa woman problem. And the intensity of the backlash grew stronger as time went on, from case study 1 to 3. The change in Japan's domestic discourse can be seen also through an analysis of media news report and amount of attention paid by them during this period. The graph on the left shows the frequency of news report on Kumaraswamy report, which defined Khampa woman as sex slave. For example, the reason why there was a sharp surge in the number of reports on Kumaraswamy since 2013 is that after the Asahi Shimbun's fourth report on Yoshida's age was found out, the Japanese government demanded a partial revision of Kumaraswamy report, which cited Yoshida's testimony. That's why the word Kumaraswamy report received a lot of attention from the media. And the graph on the right shows the similar data on the Kono statement, which had received renewed attention and criticism through the 2000s, especially as Sankei Shimbun and conservative news media began to target the Kono statement as a source of unjustified international pressure. So in sum, the conclusion of my research is that Japan is still struggling to move out of tactical concession phase, and the initial stage of international pressure actually strengthened the influence of progressive NGOs and mass media. But in later stages, a domestic backlash built up, which made it very difficult to institutionalize apologetic discourse within Japanese society. And the Japanese government and conservative elites soon learned that responding directly to international actors sometimes lead to negative effects. So therefore, they frequently focus on weakening the opposition at the domestic political level, which means that they're targeting the domestic audience rather than international audience. So Asahi Shimbun's fourth report incident and controversy over re-examining the Kono statement were part of overall countermeasure strategy of them. And in fact, the key focus of international pressure has been on the violation of human and women's rights committed during the past war. But conservative elites in Japan perceive the criticism to be an attack on the honor and credibility of present-day Japan. So there is a wide gap between these two perceptions, and this triggered a powerful backlash. So this is because in tactical concession phase, as the norms are not yet institutionalized in the domestic law, the norm compliance and implementation are vulnerable to a change in political leadership and environment. So long-term institutionalization of domestic discourse is critical for the long-term stability of diplomatic agreement. Thank you.
どうもありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Professor Kim also had been very diligent with time. Now, about Japan-Korean relations, I think you have pointed out issues in relation to Japan, mostly problems about Japan, and maybe there would be some refute raised by the audience or perhaps other panelists on the Korean problem. So let us go on.
From the University of Osaka, we have Professor Sakamoto. I'm Sakamoto from the University of Osaka. And with regards to the history issue and issues on the perception of history, I would like to take about 10 minutes to talk about the factors of the U.S.-Japan reconciliation after World War II. So history, perception of history, and the reconciliation between nations. When we think about this, what is most important is that history does not have a strange entanglement with reconciliation. And in order to prevent that, I think that there should be some principles, and I believe that there are two. And here I would like to talk about the foundation of the U.S.-Japan reconciliation, the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which, as you know, was concluded between Japan and 8 allied powers, including the United States, in 1951. And it was called the Treaty of Reconciliation and Trust. So I'd like to talk about this treaty and its relationship with the two principles that I just mentioned. First principle, if there is a gap in the perception of history between nations, one should not forcibly try to fill the gap. In other words, the issue of history and reconciliation between nations, if it's the Pacific War, and the history of the Pacific War, it could be that you could have discussions among the nations to try to fill the gap. But instead, despite there being a gap in the perception of history, how can you still have a good relation? I think that is at issue. Of course, it is not positive that there is a gap between the perception of history, because such a gap could inflict emotional pain and lead to negative emotions. But even if you made the effort to fill the gap, this gap exists in people's heads and hearts. Therefore, it is not easy to fill the gap. And if you try to fill the gap forcibly, it might hinder reconciliation and perhaps lead to even further quarrels. Yes, it is difficult to fill the gap, but at least it might be positive to learn about this gap, what its structure is and why it was realized in the first place. I am an expert on history of foreign policy, and so, of course, I am interested in understanding the gap in the perception of history between one's country and other countries, and it's part of my job. So I'd like to say that is true, but you have to be careful, because it could be that the more you learn about the gap in perception, the more you could become frustrated and angry about the other party. And people often say that you should forgive but not forget, and I think that this is a fine spirit. However, at the same time, I believe that such a spirit could inflict excessive psychological burden on the average citizen and therefore not be very realistic. There could be a past where you want to forgive but you can't. For example, the A-bombing on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Last year, President Obama was the first incumbent president to visit Hiroshima, and the Japanese government did not ask for an apology. That's natural. Even if there was an apology, one would not be able to forgive. And even if you want to forgive, no one is qualified to forgive. It is not the Japanese government, nor the survivors of the A-bomb who have such a qualification. Despite it being wartime, whatever the reason, so many innocent civilians were killed through the use of such a cruel and inhumane weapon of mass destruction. So you cannot forgive such a past, and there is no qualification to forgive such a past. If there is such a qualification, it will be God, and you say to err is human, to forgive divine. But I wonder, in the case of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would even God be able to forget such an act? And so instead of forgive but not forget, I would think that you cannot forgive but you will forget or pretend to forget. I think that spirit might be more practical for reconciliation between peoples. The San Francisco Peace Treaty is called the Treaty of Reconciliation and Trust for several reasons. In connection with history and reconciliation, this treaty does not refer to why the war occurred and who is responsible. In other words, there is no allusion to the responsibility for the war. That portion is forgotten, or you pretend to forget. The San Francisco Peace Treaty was drafted by the US and UK, but actually The draft prepared by the British government in the preamble said the following: Japan, under the militarist regime, became a party to the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, undertook a war of aggression, and thereby provoked a state of war with the Allied and associated powers and with other United Nations, and bears her share of responsibility for the war. So that was a British draft. And the British government, like the American government, wanted a peace treaty that was not so punitive against Japan, but they felt that this should be written in. However, the American government summarily refuses this preamble because the American government wanted to utilize Japan as a bulwark against the expansion of communism in Asia, to protect and cultivate Japan as a friend and ally, and this determination was further reinforced after the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. So they felt it better to pretend to forget. In other words, they felt that it was more important to cooperate for the future instead of condemning the past. In other words, reconciliation was more important than history. The Cold War was proceeding, and there was fierce fighting during the Korean War, and the international environment was changing, and so it was better to cooperate for the future. It was not because the history problem was resolved that there was reconciliation. Rather, because you are reconciling, the history issue was not so important. Maybe as a historian, this sounds a bit dangerous. Maybe people will say, are you saying that history is not useful for reconciliation and needs to be forgotten? And they would worry about my profession. So I would have to talk about my second principle with regards to history and reconciliation. The other principle that I value is history is something to learn, not to criticize other people. And if you uphold such a principle, then history could be quite useful for the reconciliation between nations. In the background of the success of the San Francisco Peace Treaty was that the past was ignored in the international environment, which was the Cold War, but it's also a case of learning from the past. I mentioned the British draft, and actually the American government in secret, they should not have, but in secret showed this draft to the Japanese government. And there was fierce opposition from the pro-British Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, and he said such a draft would only be a repetition of the fiasco of the Treaty of Versailles leading to Hitler. If you think about the national character of the Japanese people, it would only lead to the rise of the far right and far left opposing the peace treaty, and therefore he prepared a document and made a strong request to the American government, which partly I would like to read. The British draft possesses, as is plainly indicated in the preamble, the character of a peace treaty to be imposed by the victor on the vanquished who has unconditionally surrendered. Such a treaty would mean, as Mr. Dulles told the Prime Minister the other day, a repetition of the mistake of the Versailles Treaty. It would inevitably cause a great disappointment to the entire Japanese people and utterly destroy the desire and enthusiasm which the American draft done so much to awaken among them. So, if this draft came into being, the Japanese people would be disappointed, and the bases are being leased, and the Japanese people are cooperating with the Korean War, but then their feelings would be weakened, so this was what was threatened. And Prime Minister Yoshida could go as far to say that because the American representative leading the conclusion of the San Francisco Peace Treaty was envoy Mr. Dulles, who also learned from the failure of the Treaty of Versailles and was in agreement with Prime Minister Yoshida. Some of you may know that Yoshida and Dulles both attended the Paris Peace Conference where the Treaty of Versailles was concluded. They were part of the government delegations, and so in a personal way, they wanted to learn from their mistakes. Especially Dulles felt Article 231, that is the infamous war guilt clause, laying all the blame of the war to Germany. He was involved in the preparation of 231, and therefore he regretted that act. So, in thinking about the issue of history and reconciliation, I have spoken about two principles using the San Francisco Peace Treaty as an example, and I hope that you can think that both principles have utility. However, pretending to forget or not criticizing and not filling gaps, that will not take away the pain of history and history perception. Some people may counter in this way that negative feelings will remain, and I think that is probably the case. And however, there are people who feel they don't want to reconcile, they always want to remember the past and criticize, and I'm not going to preach to those people. However, with such feelings, even if there were reconciliation and friendship, the relationship would be very awkward, and it would only increase the emotional pain as well as the unpleasant feelings. The emotional pain and the negative feelings brought about by this perception of history can perhaps be suppressed with the passage of time. In other words, in 30 years' time, it will be the centenary of the World War II, after World War II, and that means that the emotional pain and the negative feelings will be somewhat weaker. And it might be as if the European people are looking back on the history of World War I now. And of course, this is a pill that can only be taken in 30 years' time, but we can imagine taking the pill today and it would have some effect at the least. This kind of pill, a placebo. I want to take such a placebo and try to think about history and reconciliation with these two principles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sakamoto. Very clear-cut, and also the suggestive, informative presentation. At the outset, there were presentations on Sino-Japanese and the Japanese-Korean presentation, and some suggestions directed to maybe Korean people, Chinese people, but at the same time to Japanese, of course, to us. I'd like to invite Professor Toncha Winchaku, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation for me to join this event. At first, when I accepted the invitation, I felt quite a bit concerned because I'm not specialist in this kind of subject. I have read news, but I have not paid much attention or closely attention, partly because it's too difficult issue for me. But I decided to come partly because it doesn't cost to organize so much. I came from Chiba, so it's cheap. So if I say something not quite useful, not quite enlightened, please forgive me, but at least it costs much less. My concern is correct, that I'm not expert. But the more I heard from the beginning from President Kidaoka until the previous paper from Professor Sakamoto, I feel that I'm glad that I'm not in that field. It's too serious. It's too much contention. Even first 5, 6, 7 papers, I can feel that it's not going to be resolved. History, pain, every issue still on the table. I enjoy my own useless, no implication in unpractical subject. I study maps and study many other subjects which doesn't have practical implication. Because for me, history is for, I agree, is for learning, but I disagree with the rest. Let me before backing to my subject, which is short in this sheet, I'd like to remind, I have an extra comment adding to the sheet, the outline of my talk here. From the beginning of today until the previous paper, we have touched on common issues involving history, which is a subject that I plan to address. But we also talk about forgiveness, talk a lot about reconciliation. Only President Kitaoka mentioned responsibility, and I haven't heard even a single time the word justice. You may think justice is slippery, especially for international relations. I know. For international relations, since the entity become national, not individuals, everything seems to be difficult in different ways. It's hard to decide the right or wrong. It's hard to decide ways to point who to forgive, who to be forgiven. If the conflict happens to individuals, which happen, I'm more familiar with that, partly because I'm working on an issue of the massacre in Thailand in 1976. 41 years already. If the state try to forget, because they keep saying exactly what Professor Sakamoto said a moment ago, history is to learn, not to judge. The state saying that, meaning don't judge them, meaning let's forget. Do you think in the context of not international relation, or if the subject is individual relation, if the relation between the state and people, can we overlook history? Can we forget? And can we ignore the word justice? If we can't, if we cannot, why in international relations we can? Or should we? I know it's difficult and non-realistic. Even for state and people relations, it's still difficult. 41 years is no justice for a massacre in 1976 in Thailand. It's not easy. For international relations, it must be more difficult. Yet, I hope that we don't drop the word. Keep the word. Whatever justice means in this context, I'm too ignorant to offer any solution. I just have hope that we cannot ignore that. How can we reach that? That's another thing. Now, back to my point. I want to deal with, I guess that we are going to deal with those kind of issues: history, forgiveness, reconciliation, justice, responsibility, and I plan to talk only about one issue: how to handle history. Even for that subject, I do not have solution to offer. I can only say that, number one, in my sheet, we already talk a lot. No need. I can skip. History, historical ideology, and certain historical culture leads to nationalism, so on and so forth. I skip. Just example, without much explanation because it would be too long. Thai historical ideology regarding Cambodia, even though in a world scale, is a minor issue, but it has not been resolved. It has not been resolved. In fact, I remember when I was young and ASEAN was initiated, most academics in South or look down on the concept of ASEAN because every country in Southeast Asia don't like each other much. So how come ASEAN comes into assistance? Every country in Southeast Asia don't like each other much, partly or mainly because historical ideology. For many other factors, they can like each other. For mutual interest, for economic interest, and that's how ASEAN is built on the present, built on the future. On the other hand, ASEAN has not solved the issue of historical hostility, or at least in perception. I'm not sure they should forget or not, but let's say they try. I agree with Professor Sakamoto that one strategy of ASEAN is try to get over that. Don't touch that, and focus on the present and the future. Otherwise, it's hard to build ASEAN. So a case in point, historical ideology of Thailand and Cambodia, or I would extend for Southeast Asia, historical hostility towards one another. A lot, even hundreds of years, hasn't been resolved. On the other hand, Thailand is a rare exception in Southeast Asia. Most countries in Southeast Asia got the effects of Japanese Pacific War during World War II, except Thailand. Thailand got some, but not much, and partly because Thai government at the time are pro-Japanese. They cooperated to some extent with the Japanese. That's the simple reason why they're not hostile to Japanese, because they're partners during the war. Every other country got the effects. But it doesn't mean that history always has to produce hostility. This morning, a gentleman raised the issue of Singapore. I agree, mutual interest, economic interest play a factor. But I'd like to raise one more thing. If you go to National Museum of Singapore, it's full of story of Japanese invasion. They didn't hide it. The national history of Singapore emphasized Japanese invasion. Yet, it doesn't produce hostility towards Japan. How? By whatever means, Singapore make it to the point that people hate war rather than people hate the past war. Hate war rather than Japan that caused trouble, caused damages to them during the past war. That's a difference. One final point, number 3 in my sheet. I think I agree. History is for learn. It's for intellectual maturity. But to ask people to forget is unrealistic. I put it in here. History is not for emotional attachment, which including nationalism. I know that this is unrealistic. But I agree that in the future, we should change the way we learn history to make it for intellectual maturity. It's for learning, it's for thinking, not for attachment. It's already the past. If we have that kind of attitude toward history, we don't have to forget. We don't have to forget. We can learn everything instead of forgetting, but not attach to the parties in conflict. And perhaps we can approach the question of justice easier without attachment, without taking side too much. Perhaps we can think about what is justice for human being rather than justice for Korea, Japan, China, or whatever.
Thank you very much. Once in a while, I serve as a moderator of a panel discussion, and today, I think my role is quite exceptional, despite the fact that there have been 4 speakers giving their presentation. We still have ample time left for panel discussion and open the floor for Q&A. This is very rare. As I mentioned at the outset, the first two statements and the latter two statements are quite different in terms of the substance. Professor Sakamoto and Professor Winnichacombe's handling of history-related discussion and the approach to history that was referred to by the first two speakers were quite different. So I would like to invite an inter-panelist discussion. I don't mean to criticize, but if I may, about Professor Kim's presentation. Your title is Settlement Without Consensus. And I wonder how you define the word consensus. Maybe we have a different definition. Isn't this settlement without satisfaction? Or do you really mean settlement without consensus? The reason I ask this question, I'm not sure whether I should raise the name, but anyway, Professor Shunji Yanai, a very renowned diplomat, said that consensus is everybody is dissatisfied, but there is an agreement reached. And so in 2015, there was this agreement reached between Japan and South Korea. Of course, there was this dissatisfaction and frustration in Japan as well as in South Korea, but it was settled. So, based on the definition in my mind of consensus, we thought that this was settlement with consensus. But if it is a settlement without consensus, I wonder what that agreement was all about. So, about this title of your presentation, what you meant by this is something that I would like to ask you. Professor Kim, please.
Okay, let me answer in English. I think I didn't have enough time to explain, the overall concept and details about my article, but basically the consensus means that consensus among Japanese public about Compo woman issue. It's not consensus between South Korea, Japan, and international community. So the official narrative and national narratives about Compo woman there's no consensus over these narratives. So there's a different narratives and different, opinion among Japanese public. So that's why even after this settlement, from the perspective of Korean side, we see many different problems and trouble, in Japanese domestic politics, because they believe that Japanese government and some conservative politicians and elite do not accept, these apologetic narratives about Compo women. That's my answer.
はい、他に、はい、
Anything goes?
Yeah. Make a couple of comments about your general question. On the point about the differences between this side of the panel versus the other side of the panel, I admire the two gentlemen on the other side of the table who advocate a pretty lofty idea about try to forget, try to forgive if not forget, and then let bygones be bygones, and let's move on to face the future. I do admire that idea. I wish that could happen in every cases, but in some cases it's harder to do than to say it. One observation I have is that for cases where you have involved very deep trauma in the past, And also, there's a very clear-cut victim in the case, in the conflict, versus a clear-cut victimizer. Then it would be much harder, other things being equal, much harder for people to say we can forgive, especially for the victim side to say we can forgive, even without first being offered a sincere apology. So in the case of U.S.-Japan relations, I believe it's a relatively easier case where you could arguably say that there's no clear-cut victim versus victimizer. You could say that the Americans probably killed more Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and also other military combats. But the Americans could say that the Japanese gave us this evil surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and they started the war, so the moral responsibility is on them. So that part is not clear-cut. Why in the China-Japan case and South Korea-Japan case, this is a total different story. And second point is that in the case where the elites have very strong political incentives to use history for practical purposes and agendas, then it's very hard for you simply say, let's move on and let this stay behind. In the cases of U.S.-Japan relations, because of the alliance, because of the Cold War, because of the Japanese dependence on United States for security and for economic assistance after World War II, there are very important economic and political incentive for them not to manipulate history, not to make historical memory a big impediment to their relationship. Why in the cases of Japan-South Korea, Japan-China, and even the German-Polish case in the earlier period, there were very strong political utility in manipulating history. In those cases, then you have to really work hard on demystify the historical interpretation and try to bridge the gap between their memories through historians' dialogue, joint studies, and other measures of restitutions. That's just my personal take on these questions.
はい、当然坂本先生がおっしゃるだろうと思ってました。よろしくお願いします。
林さんにも質問。
Yes, I thought Dr. Sakamoto wanted to speak, and I wanted to ask a question to Professor He about the victims and the victimizers, the relationship, whether they are clear. I do agree with you. It's not possible under several cases to let's forget about what happened in the past and forgive. But for reconciliation, what I spoke about is, of course, ideal. Now, from 1950s to 1960s, the Communist China's history cover-up. What kind of cover-up was that? Well, the Chinese public was really angry against Japan. And was it that the Communist Party or the Chinese government suppressed this public anger? And they tried to whitewash? Or what actually happened? What do you mean by Communist China's historical cover-up? Well, the post-war reconciliation, 1972 joint declaration may had been facilitated with such an event in China for the Communist China history cover-up. So are you saying that the Communist Party no longer can cover up history in the past, but in the past they were able to cover up the history, or what is the reality? I was wondering what you meant by that.
The observation you had at the end of your question is pretty much right, that they can no longer cover it today. When you have a more open and pluralistic society in China, and China is being interdependent with the rest of the world and joining the whole trend of globalization, it's not possible to cover that anymore. But in the 50s and 60s, it's definitely covered up through very, very tight control of media, textbook, and all kinds of propaganda measures. If you look at the textbooks at the time, that they probably have a few pages on Nanjing Massacre and other things, but they don't go into details. They discourage people to remember the pains and sufferings they had during the war. And the arch enemy of China in the 1560s in the identity discourse was the United States. And surprisingly, the United States is actually arguably the most benign imperialist country for China in the recent history, in the modern history. But nevertheless, the United States was portrayed as the worst, most evil enemy in the national discourse in the 15th and 60s, while Japan's evil was pushed aside, and there's researches and studies and discussion of Japanese war crimes were silenced in the 50s and 60s. For the reasons that I said in my remarks, that the Chinese government really focused on counterbalancing the U.S. Security threat in the Cold War and trying to win over Japan's diplomatic support and to break Japan away from the United States.
どうぞ、キムさんどうぞ。
I have a question to Professor Sakamoto. I totally agree with your opinion and your two principles about understanding the past history problem. Especially, I agree that it is really hard to actually resolve, the problem, and it's not a problem that can be solved actually. So many scholars actually in this field suggest that we have to manage rather than resolve the history problems or the dispute and crisis. I agree with that. But we can't just simply that you have to forget, the history. So what kind of strategy could you kind of recommend to Japanese and Chinese and Korean government that actually using, this history problem as a political actually interest, to make their people to forget about, the past history problem?
はい、坂本先生お願いします。
Well, I'm a historian, so I'm not saying we should forget history, or I'm not telling you to forget history. In the case of reconciliation, you need to pretend that you've forgotten, but I'm not saying that you don't have to reconcile. And I think that's one way of thinking. And what I want to say, and it would be my recommendation, and with China and Korea, Japan in 1972 finished reconciling with China, and then ROK. There is the 65 Basic Treaty, and there is the comfort woman issue, which was settled to an extent in 2015. But that is government to government, and there is probably all kinds of dissatisfaction and grievances. So if you try to suppress that, it's probably not very good. However, I think the Japanese government's position is that they don't want to repeat apologies, but they will continue to repeat explaining. So, well, I think this is such an opportunity for reconciliation today, or thinking about how we can reconcile or how we thought we have reconciled. I think there should be repetitive explanations, and there is the 1970 statement, and that's not about the comfort women, but with regards to the history of Japanese past, the explanation is being reported. And, well, the government has to come up with this, but it's rare, and I think efforts need to be continued. So there's no true pill, only fake pills, placebos. And with the passage of time, people will forget to an extent. And so I think we should perhaps use our imagination too. Well, I think people in the audience want to ask questions, and I'm also thinking about these matters myself. And I, as moderator, want to ask a question to Professor He. It might be a bit mean. Professor Sakamoto talked about Communist China's history cover-up issue, and there was the communist rule, suppression of the media, so that the history issue could be covered up or put to the side. And I think, as many people know, the Xi Jinping government, since the opening up, is having the most severe media control. And so if that is the case, if that structure is reinforced, then should we expect another history cover-up? That's the question. And Professor Kim, you spoke mostly about the Japanese side, but is there any issue on the Korean side? Of course, we probably don't have enough time to go into length, but in 2 or 3 minutes, if you could talk about the Korean side too.
Thank you for the question. There's certainly cover-up today. It's different type of cover-up from the 50s and 60s. In the 50s and 60s, is basically the government didn't want people to talk too much about the war. They want them to talk about the conflict with the United States, and also later on conflict with Soviet Union in the 60s, but not to focus their hatred on Japan. Today's cover-up is selective censorship. So the government encourages you to remember the war and in every bit details about the war, and forget about other things that are probably not favorable. If you remember those, that would not develop favorable attitude towards its own government. So yes, it's a one-sided cover-up. So encouraging you to remember only the negative side of Sino-Japanese relations, but forget or cover up or tone down the other side of the relationship, which also make up a big part of the history of the Sino-Japanese relations. They've had a relationship for over 1,000 years, but they want you to focus on the recent history of war, but not earlier history of their exchanges and cooperation, and also post-World War II cooperation and Japanese economic assistance to China. And there was also a short period of friendship. Those things are being toned down, being slighted, but they want you to remember that Japan has been and has always been the worst enemy of China. But that's actually a new theme that's replacing the Cold War theme that was the anti-American theme.
Professor Kim?
I knew that I was going to be asked this question. And previously, in my previous article, I actually severely criticized the Korean news report practice, which is quite unbalanced, the news report practice. That's why maybe I was invited in this place, but I'm sorry if I let some of the audience down today. The only reason I made a presentation on this article is because this is most recent research of mine. That's why. And of course, there are many problems on the Korean side. For example, there is a militant NGO practice, which I don't agree with, and also inconsistent government policy, so changing government to government, and also I mentioned unbalanced report practice in Korean media, and those are the topics actually I will pursue in my future research project. So yeah, we have to look at both sides, what kind of problem each side has, and this time I only focus on Japanese side, but I will maybe move to the Korean side next time.
Thank you very much, and thank you for waiting. We still have about 15 minutes left, so I would like to entertain questions from the floor. Professor Kitaoka. Thank you for the frank views of the panelists, and there are certain points that I want to raise. I think there is not enough history research being done. China always talks about the Communist Party, and they were the major force in the war against Japan, and well, they wanted to avoid a war, but in order to hit the Nationalist Party, even information was communicated to Japan. So I think such kinds of information is also important. With regards to Korea, there's the McGraw-Hill textbook issue, and there 200,000 girls, Korean girls, were presented to the soldiers as a gift, and whatever way you think about it, that's wrong. So according to testimonies, most were adults, and the biggest group were Japanese. So if it was 200,000 girls, then there would have had to be about 500,000, or if you add Japanese, like 100,000, and it was only 1 million Japanese soldiers at the time. So I think there could be some common sense reasoning, and also the vis-a-vis McGraw-Hill, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs techniques were not very good. But there was criticism that the free opinion was being expressed. But we don't have that kind of power. We are just saying that maybe this is wrong. That was pointed out. If in a Japanese textbook it was mentioned that America used 20 A-bombs into Japan, then Washington, D.C. would probably object. So, well, there are two scholars who did the press conference, and if you get the opposing comment, they say, first of all, they will say thank you, and I will study further. That is the scholarly manner. And in Korea recently, in terms of the historical verification process about the comfort woman, I think that the Prime Minister said that he wanted to do more research. So why did and how did the Korean women become recruited as comfort women, and how much was paid, and who received the payment, and what kind of activities were done by the brokers? Without such research, just laying attack is going to be very imbalanced and very partial. And I often feel when I was at the UN, there is SEED, which is against the discrimination against women, and the Korean representative was from a group, and there was various cases mentioned about discrimination against women. Girls are kidnapped, and in Africa they are raped tactically or strategically. There are such terrible discrimination against women, and should you discuss the comfort women in the same breath? So, as a top priority. So as Professor Sakamoto mentioned, well, it's true that both sides, in terms of diplomacy, do have their dissatisfaction. But one reason is, among the assertions of the Korean side, there are some things that are not fact. And that's why it leads to ambiguous phrases. And well, a frank apology. Well, what about the frank apologies by various countries? At the time of the Asian Women's Fund, I think the letter was quite clear in apologizing in a formal way. That is, if other leaders of the world have come up with something like this, I would like to know such an example. So in this way, I think we should have a better grasp of the facts. And what I'm saying is probably the flip side of what Professor Sakamoto said.
言われて、私もさっき言われ
There was mention of the term justice, yes. Justice would have to be universal. For this person, strict justice, and for this person, lenient justice. The international relationship, that is not easy. But in justice, if one criticizes others, then one also should reflect upon oneself and be critical of oneself as well. That was Professor Kitaoka's comment rather than President of JICA. Professor Kim, any response?
I'm not historian. The finding out historical fact is not my job and not my duty. I first of all want to clarify that fact. Yeah, and then there is still controversy and debate about how many people were actually drafted and what kind of nationality they have. So there is no historical fact actually consensus by historians even. And there is a range from 50,000 to 200,000 about the people who draft. Actually, 50,000 is suggested by Hata Sensei, which is Japanese, and the 200,000 is also the number suggested by a Japanese historian, Yoshimi Yoshiaki Sensei. So if you claim that whether the Koreans know about the fact or not, I'm not sure whether how can I answer for that question. You argue that what is a sincere apology? I think it's easy to offer sincere apology, and I believe that Japanese government actually did sincere apology. But I think important thing is follow up, what you did after you offer sincere apology. I think the problem is Korean side do not sense and perceive that your apology is sincere after what you, not you, the government and some of conservative politicians do, because even after this settlement, the Korean government and Korean people and victims have to hear that they are drafted by not force, but they were, were prostitute. So if, because that's why I'm arguing that the national consensus and the national official narrative about Kampa woman, which is apologetic, narrative is necessary to actually calm down the Korean side, because even though you argue that how many times we apologize, but it doesn't matter that the victim side cannot feel that it is sincere apology.
ありがとうございました。それでは細谷先生。
慶応大学の細谷と申します。
細谷 of Keio University. Well, the questions concentrate on you, sorry, but to Professor Kim. From a different point of view, if I may, I should like to make some comment together with questions. In your slide, the gap, you said international community versus Japanese government. You mentioned that you are not the historian, but I specialize in international politics and diplomacy. Well, what I'd like to say is that a certain government versus international community in unison, this kind of relationship is not plausible. Because international community, there are plural, various views, and it's not the international community as a whole in one unity confronting the government of Japan. I know you do not think so, but this kind of expression should be avoided. And you talked about Korea, but there is also the comfort women issue with the Netherlands. And between the government of the Netherlands and the government of Japan, we have the Women's Fund covering 79 comfort women. And why is it that between the Netherlands and Japan, no major issue, but Korea there is a major issue, because in Korean side you have a simplistic description as if international community as a whole is confronting Japan, and so detail should be easy. It should be difficult. The important, not a textbook only. because in terms of comfort women, if you only look at South Korea and disregard the Netherlands case, that disregards the important details. And there are interests and domestic demand and interests in any country. It's not the one side alone to blame in this misunderstanding. And different interests and different positions, then description as if the government of Japan is monolithic and confronting the international community again in unity and monolithic. This is not the way, it should not be the way to describe this. True, there were problems and issues on the Japanese side about the comfort women, but it's not. It is rather misleading that in international relationship, the international community is all unified in view. It is more diversified and with different views, just like the Netherlands case signifies.
Thank you very much. Earlier, I talked about the sufficiency of time for Q&A, but we are approaching towards the end of this session, so I would like to have you respond to the question.
Minister at the German Embassy, I have a very short comment on the discussion we just had. From Japanese speakers, I've heard two very interesting definitions of history. It was Mr. Kanehara who said, history is always living. If the future changes, the past changes as well. And we've heard from our keynote speaker, a correct reading of history is essential. If I take these two sentences, there's a conflict. First of all, sometimes facts are clear, sometimes they're in dispute. It's my understanding that, for example, if you look at the Nanjing Massacre, one of the biggest contentious issues between Japan and China is the number of victims. Is it less than 200,000, as Japan says? Is it up to 300,000, as China says? We just heard a discussion on potential numbers of victims of the so-called comfort women issue. In my country, in Germany, we ended decades ago to have quarrels about the number of Holocaust victims who were killed in German organized and run concentration camps. I remember when I was young, there were debates. Is it 6 million or is it 5.2 million? We no longer have such debates. And my question to Japan and China would be, does it really matter whether or not in Nanjing it was 195,000 or 295,000? Facts matter. If you can establish them, it's a worthy pursuit for historians to come as close to reality as you can. But sometimes the interpretation of what history means does not necessarily depend on a mathematically correct number. This was my personal comment. Thank you very much.
はい、ありがとうございました。
Thank you for your input. Now, Dr. Kitaoka, do you have a brief comment you were referred to earlier? So about the number of Holocaust, there was no large difference, and that was because intentionally the Nazi killed a certain number of people in the concentration camp, and there was a record. But in Japan, we don't have a record like that, and we don't have an accurate history of the victims of the Nagasaki or the Hiroshima A-bomb. The Nanjing Massacre, well, of course, the writers say that this didn't happen, but I do believe that there was this illegal conduct, And this needs to be studied in detail, and this has to be conducted, if possible, together with China to really study the details. I believe details are also very important. I'm pretty sure many of you would like to take the floor, but I cannot sacrifice coffee break. So among the panelists, do you have a burning desire to make a final say? At most 1 to 2 minutes. Anybody? Well, about this number of victims, well, based on common sense, 300,000 people died is the Nanjing Massacre. And Xi Jinping says that it is about 35 million people, which means that there needs to be 117 similar incidents like the Nanjing Massacre. And so we have to think about what is wrong about these numbers. As Dr. Kitaoka said, it is necessary to look into the numbers. But maybe this ballpark number or a rough estimate may suffice.
Respond to your sharp comments. I believe that the quote from the E.H. Carr about the historical objectivity. He said something like, if you look at the mountain from different angles, then the mountain will take up multiple shapes, but doesn't mean that there are multiple mountains. There are only one mountain. So there is the possibility to agree on some basic consensus about the big facts, and especially at the intergovernmental level for political reconciliation. And once you agree on the basic big facts, then it's okay for historians to continue research and debate and disagree on the specific details. So using the case of Nanjing Massacre, I think what the Chinese and Japanese government should focus on agreeing on the fact that it happened, and Japan slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, and then leave it to the historians to figure out the specific documentary evidence or whatever witness evidence to substantiate their historians' views about how many people actually died.
Yes, please.
Historian, something wrong in the way we learn history. That's all I can say. Otherwise, may I, since nobody answered Professor Hosaya, I answer one sentence as well. Why there is no problem with the country to South Korea? I repeat the word I said a moment ago. Until you reach a point that they feel like they receive justice, justice has been served. Even though the word justice is slippery, I agree. But you can call all the factors. We did mention political power, we did mention so many other things, but until the point that the victim feels justice has been served, that's the end point. If it doesn't get to that point, it's not over.
この最後の知恵の言葉で、第2部。
So with this word of great wisdom, we would like to bring this session to a close. And I would like to once again thank the 4 speakers with a big hand. Thank you very much, the moderator and the panelists. And we would like to break for coffee. And the third part would get started at 2:50.